My name is William Carter. I'm 63, and last Christmas Eve, I thought life had finally slowed down enough for me to enjoy it. The house was glowing with lights, the smell of roast filled the air, and for the first time in months, both of my children were home. It should have been perfect, yet something in me felt unsettled, like a whisper that the night was not what it seemed. Then my phone buzzed with a message from my lawyer, 4 urgent words that made my chest tighten. Call me immediately. What he told me about my wife pulled the ground from under me, and nothing in my life would ever look the same again. How well do we really know the people we share our home with, and what would you do if the person beside you was hiding the kind of secret that could destroy everything? Stay with me, because once you hear what happened, you won't be able to stop listening. The December wind rattled the windows as I straightened the candles on the dining table. Outside, Bellevue's streets glowed with Christmas lights, little bursts of color against the dark. I had just turned 63, and I told myself tonight should be about family, about warmth, about setting work aside. Margaret was in the kitchen humming carols as she basted the roast. Our daughter Emily had flown up from Portland, and our son David had driven in from Spokane. For the first time in months, both kids were home, and I wanted to believe it meant something. I adjusted the silverware maybe too carefully, because Margaret looked in from the kitchen and said with a teasing smile, "You'll wear grooves into that table if you keep fussing." I tried to smile back. She wore a red sweater that shimmered in the light, her hair pinned neatly. To anyone else, she looked like the perfect hostess. To me, lately, there was something distant in her eyes, like a window I could no longer see through. The house smelled of pine from the 12-foot tree in the corner, and the buttery scent of mashed potatoes. I should have been at ease, but my chest carried a tightness I couldn't shake. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and poured a glass of wine. I told myself it was just nerves, another holiday, another attempt at playing the part of a happy family. The doorbell rang, and Emily rushed in, wrapped in a long coat, her cheeks red from the cold. She kissed my cheek, warm and bright, then disappeared into the kitchen to greet her mother. David arrived minutes later, carrying a bottle of bourbon, grinning like he had already sampled some of it on the drive. They laughed and chattered, filling the house with the noise I usually longed for. I sat at the edge of it, listening, trying to memorize the ordinary sounds. I thought of all the years I had worked late, missing these moments. 30 years ago, I had borrowed $75,000 against our first house to start Carter Systems in a drafty garage. Back then, Margaret believed in me without question. Tonight, watching her glide around the kitchen, I wondered what she believed in now. I felt the vibration before I heard the chime. My phone lit up on the counter. Richard Cole, my attorney and my friend for more than 2 decades. The text was short. Call me immediately. For a moment, I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe a missed dial, maybe an accidental send. Richard knew I was with family tonight. My thumb hovered, my pulse quickened. I glanced toward the kitchen, where Margaret laughed at something Emily said, her hand brushing her daughter's shoulder, as if nothing in the world could disturb her joy. I excused myself quietly, muttering something about checking the roast, and slipped down the hallway into my study. The door clicked shut behind me, muffling the music and laughter. The glow of the phone seemed harsher in the dim light. I hit call, my hand trembling. Richard picked up on the first ring. "Bill, I need you to listen carefully." My heart pounded. "What is it?" His voice was tight, professional, stripped of any holiday warmth. "Your wife filed a petition this afternoon. She's asking the court to declare you incompetent to manage Carter Systems." For a moment, I thought I misheard him. The words hung there unreal. "That can't be," I whispered. She filed with supporting affidavits. "It's real." My throat closed. "Margaret, he went on, "she's aligned with Daniel Harris, and she's hired Laura Blake. You know what that means. They're moving fast. A hearing is scheduled within 6 weeks. We need to act now." I gripped the desk so hard, my knuckles whitened. Daniel Harris. A man I had trusted with 20% of the company, a man I had welcomed into my home. And Laura Blake, notorious for turning family disputes into public executions. My head swam. My head. Richard's voice cut through. Bill, I'm sorry to do this tonight, but you had to know. She's already secured backing from some shareholders. They're painting you as unstable. That grief over Elena's death has clouded your judgment. Elena. The name struck like ice water. My late wife, the mother of my children, gone 5 years now. The grief was real, but to use her memory this way was something I couldn't have imagined. I pressed my forehead into my palm, struggling to breathe evenly. Through the closed door, I could hear faint laughter from the dining room. The clink of plates, the comfort of family life that suddenly felt staged. What do I do, Richard? His answer was firm. You prepare. We'll gather medical evaluations, financial reports, testimonies. But you must be ready for war. And Bill, do not confront Margaret tonight. Not yet. I swallowed hard, staring at the shelves lined with photographs, awards, mementos of a life built from scratch. I had thought this Christmas Eve would be another ritual of family togetherness. Instead, it had become the night I discovered my marriage was a mask. I ended the call. The phone heavy in my hand, the silence of the study pressing in. I forced myself to straighten, to adjust my tie, to breathe as if nothing had changed. In the other room, Margaret's laughter rose again, clear and practiced, and I understood that everything had. I opened the study door, and the sound of Christmas music rushed back in, warm and deceptively cheerful. The living room glowed from the lights wrapped around the tree presents stacked neatly beneath. Emily sat cross-legged on the rug, showing Margaret pictures on her phone while David poured himself a drink at the sideboard. I slid back into the room, adjusting my face into something calm, something ordinary. Margaret glanced at me with that poised smile she had perfected over the years. The kind that could pass for affection, if you wanted to believe it. Dinner is ready, she said lightly, and motioned toward the table. I nodded, forcing my voice steady. Smells wonderful. We gathered around the dining table, the china we reserved for holidays, gleaming under the chandelier. The turkey sat in the center, golden and steaming, the kind of picture that might have made it onto a magazine cover. Margaret carved with practiced ease, passing slices to each of us, her bracelets clinking softly with every movement. Emily filled her plate and leaned forward, her eyes bright. I can't believe I'm actually here for Christmas this year. Work has been so crazy, but I promised myself I wouldn't miss it. She turned toward me, her expression softening. It's good to be home, Dad. I managed to smile, touched by her sincerity. I'm glad you're here. Really glad. David raised his glass, a sly grin on his face. To Mom, who somehow pulled this all together. We're spoiled, you know. Margaret beamed at him, as if he were still the boy who used to trail after her in the kitchen. Thank you, darling. I couldn't have done it without a little help, though. She let the words hang there, her eyes flicking toward me, then back to the turkey. I caught the subtle jab and felt my jaw tighten. Emily chattered about her work in Portland, the new nonprofit project she was excited about. David launched into stories from his architecture firm, how his team had landed a big contract downtown. I listened, nodding, letting the conversation wash over me. The clink of silverware, the warmth of candles, the rhythm of holiday cheer filled the air. Yet under it all, I heard Richard's voice in my head, repeating the word, petition, a shadow across every smile. At one point, David leaned back in his chair and said casually, You know, Dad, you've done amazing things with Carter Systems, but maybe it's time to slow down a little. He laughed, trying to soften the edge. Maybe pass more responsibility on, enjoy life while you can. Margaret's hand rested lightly on his arm, her expression serene. That's a thought, isn't it? After all, Everyone deserves a chance to rest. Her tone was gentle, almost sympathetic, but to me it sounded rehearsed. I set my fork down carefully. The company is not just numbers on a page, I said. It's people, livelihoods, families who depend on us. I don't think I can walk away from that. Emily quickly interjected, trying to ease the tension. Dad's right. His work has always meant something bigger. She reached across and touched my hand. But maybe balance wouldn't hurt either. For a moment the table was silent, except for the sound of the fire popping in the hearth. Margaret refilled her wineglass. Her eyes lowered, her smile faint. The rest of the meal went on with lighter chatter. Emily told a funny story about a disastrous holiday party at her office. David shared a story from his college days that had Emily in stitches. I laughed when it was expected, nodded when I should, but my mind was elsewhere, circling the truth I had learned minutes earlier. After dessert, Margaret stood and began clearing plates. Emily jumped up to help the two of them, moving in sync, laughing quietly. I watched them from my seat, my chest tightening with a mix of love and unease. David poured himself another bourbon and leaned toward me. You know, Dad, I think Mom's right about slowing down. No one can run forever. His words were casual, but the implication dug deep. I swallowed my frustration. We'll see, I murmured, unwilling to say more. The evening wound down with coffee in the living room. Margaret curled gracefully into the armchair, Emily beside her on the sofa. David sprawled with his glass. We exchanged gifts, little things wrapped in gold paper, the kind of ritual we had repeated for years. I opened a wool scarf Margaret had chosen, thanked her, wrapped it around my shoulders. She smiled, eyes lingering on me, as if nothing in the world was wrong. By 10 o'clock, Emily was yawning, and David stretched, saying he had an early drive back. Margaret kissed them both goodbye at the door, her voice full of affection. I stood behind her, the image of a united family framed in the glow of the porch light. They waved from their cars, headlights disappearing down the street. When the house was quiet again, I turned toward Margaret. She hung her coat neatly on the hook, smoothed her sweater, and met my gaze with that same unreadable calm. It was a lovely evening, wasn't it? She said softly. I held her eyes, searching for something real beneath the surface. Yes, I answered, my voice even. Lovely. She touched my arm briefly, then moved past me toward the stairs, humming the same carol she had been singing earlier. I stood in the foyer alone, the scent of pine thick in the air, the lights on the tree blinking in steady rhythm. My tie felt suddenly tight against my throat, and I loosened it with trembling fingers. The night had given me everything I should have wanted: a family gathered, laughter, warmth. Yet as I stood there in the silence of our home, I knew the picture-perfect evening was only a mask, and underneath it the foundation of my life was beginning to crack. I climbed the stairs slowly, the weight of the evening pressing on my shoulders. The house was quiet except for the soft creak of the steps and the distant hum of the furnace. Margaret's door closed with a gentle click down the hall, leaving me alone in the dim light. I entered my study and shut the door behind me, as if that thin barrier could keep the unease contained. The shelves of books and framed photographs felt like silent witnesses. My phone rested on the desk, still carrying Richard's warning like a hidden ember. I sat down heavily and pressed his number again. He answered on the first ring, his voice brisk but steady. Bill, I was expecting your call. I leaned back, running a hand across my face. Tell me everything. Richard did not waste time. Margaret filed late this afternoon. The petition asks the court to declare you incompetent to manage Carter's systems. She's alleging emotional instability and impaired judgment tied to Elena's death. I closed my eyes. Elena's name striking me again with a familiar ache. She had been gone 5 years, but grief never truly left. Using her memory against me felt like a wound being torn open. Richard continued, "She is not alone. Daniel Harris has aligned with her. He's backing her financially and pushing her case with other shareholders, and she's hired Laura Blake. You know her record?" My stomach nodded. Laura Blake was infamous for family business disputes, known for turning personal tragedies into courtroom theater. If she was on Margaret's side, then this was no idle threat. "How much support do they have?" I asked quietly. "Some," Richard admitted. "Daniel controls nearly 20%. Patricia Lewis has shown interest. Others are wavering. They're claiming Carter Systems needs modern leadership, that you resist innovation, that your decisions are based on sentiment rather than strategy." I pushed myself upright, gripping the armrests. Carter Systems has had steady growth every year. 12% last year. Employee retention over 90%. That is not sentiment, that is leadership. I know Richard said, but they are reframing the narrative. Painting you as an aging patriarch clinging to the past. We need to prepare to dismantle their claims piece by piece. I rubbed my temple, the ache spreading behind my eyes. How long before the hearing? 6 weeks. That gives us time, but we cannot waste a day. You'll need medical evaluations, psychiatric assessments, documentation proving your competence. I'll arrange appointments immediately. 6 weeks. The words echoed both a reprieve and a sentence. Enough time to prepare, enough time to feel every ounce of betrayal. And Daniel? I muttered the taste of his name, bitter. I brought him into this company. I trusted him. "That trust is gone now," Richard said firmly. "You need to see him as an opponent. He has positioned himself as Margaret's partner in this." I stared at the framed photo on my desk, one taken at the ribbon cutting of our headquarters in Seattle. Daniel stood beside me, smiling with a hand on my shoulder. Margaret had been in the front row that day, applauding proudly. Or so I thought. Richard's voice softened. "Bill, listen. Do not confront Margaret tonight. I know you want answers, but we need to move carefully. Gather evidence, not outbursts." I nodded, though he could not see me. "You're right. But God help me, Richard. She's in the next room, and I don't know how to look at her anymore. You play your part for now. Let her think you are unaware. That will give us the advantage. I'll contact you tomorrow with next steps. Get some rest if you can." The line went dead, leaving me in silence again. I set the phone down, my hand trembling slightly, and leaned back in the chair. Through the window, the neighborhood shimmered with holiday lights, houses lined with glowing reindeer and wreaths. The world carried on in celebration while mine crumbled in secrecy. I thought of Emily's smile at the table, of David raising his glass to Margaret, of the warmth that had seemed so real for a fleeting moment. How could they know that beneath the roast turkey and the carefully wrapped gifts, their mother had already struck at the heart of everything I had built? I rose from the chair, moving slowly through the study, tracing my fingers along the spines of old ledgers, awards, photographs of groundbreaking ceremonies. 30 years of work, of sacrifice, of late nights spent drafting proposals while Margaret slept in the next room. I had believed it was all for us, for our family. Now I questioned what any of it meant. The house remained quiet, only the faint sound of Margaret's footsteps overhead. Then silence. I shut off the desk lamp and stood in the dark, listening to the hollow thud of my own heartbeat. I loosened my tie completely and draped it over the chair. On the desk sat a photograph of Elena holding Emily as a child, both of them laughing in a summer field. I picked it up, my thumb brushing the glass. Margaret had once stood by my side through those years, smiling, urging me forward. I wondered when that devotion had soured into ambition of her own. I placed the frame back carefully and crossed to the window. Snowflakes drifted past the glass, soft and silent, dusting the driveway below. It should have been a peaceful sight, but to me it looked like ash falling over ruins. I stayed there until my legs ached, then finally turned out the light. The staircase creaked under my steps, the shadows deepening around me. Somewhere down the hall, Margaret shifted in bed, the sound muffled by the door. I paused listening, then moved on, without a word. Sleep did not come easily that night. When it did, it carried me into restless dreams, of boardrooms turning hostile, of Margaret's calm smile as strangers measured my worth, of Daniel's hand clasping hers in the glare of a courtroom. I woke before dawn, my throat dry, my chest heavy. The house was still dark when I padded down to the kitchen. The scent of pine lingered from the tree, the remnants of dinner stacked in the sink. I filled a glass with water and sat at the table alone. The silence pressed in thick and unforgiving. I knew then that Christmas morning would not bring peace or joy, only the first steps of a battle I had never imagined fighting. The morning sky was still gray when I pulled into the parking lot of Carter Systems headquarters. The streets were slick from melted snow. The city quieter than usual, with most families still wrapped in their Christmas celebrations. I had called Steve Wallace before dawn, asking him to meet me at the office. He didn't hesitate. Sarah Mitchell was already waiting by the time I arrived, her laptop open, a paper cup of coffee steaming beside her. The building felt different that morning, stripped of the usual hum of staff and chatter. Holiday decoration still hung in the lobby, garlands along the railings, a tree glittering near reception. They looked out of place against the weight pressing in on me. Steve was in the conference room when I walked in, sleeves rolled up, his silver hair a little disheveled. He had a folder in front of him, pages spread out like a battle plan. "About time you called me, Bill," he said. I shook his hand, the grip firm and familiar. I didn't want to believe it until last night. Sarah looked up from her laptop, her face pale. "I think you need to see this, Mr. Carter." She swiveled the screen toward me. Lines of emails filled the display, Margaret's name clear in the sender line. I leaned closer, my chest tightening as I read. Margaret and Daniel discussing meetings with shareholders, phrases like transition plan and new leadership. She had written, "Once Bill is declared incompetent, we can restructure immediately." Another email outlined promises of higher dividends, cutting costs through automation, painting a vision that gutted the company culture I had fought to build. My throat went dry. "How did you get these?" I asked quietly. Sarah hesitated. A junior analyst flagged unusual transfers, so I pulled the records. It led me here. There are multiple emails, Mr. Carter. This isn't just speculation. Steve slid another document across the table. This is worse. He pointed to the page. Your Bellevue house. Margaret mortgaged it last month for $2 million. The funds went into a private account. Then portions were funneled into campaign expenses connected to Daniel's firm. I stared at the paper, the words blurring. Our home, the place where we raised our children, where every holiday photograph was taken, had been quietly turned into collateral for her scheme. I felt my hands tremble and forced them flat against the table. She put our home on the line. Steve's eyes met mine steady. This isn't just betrayal, Bill. This is theft. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The silence stretched heavy between us. Finally, I managed, "What else do we know?" Sarah scrolled quickly. So far, about $950,000 has been moved from discretionary budgets. Some of it disguised as consulting fees, some hidden under marketing expenses. If we don't act, they'll claim it was all authorized. I sank into the chair, rubbing my forehead. It was one thing to hear Richard say it last night, another to see the numbers staring back at me in black and white. Steve leaned forward. We need a plan. You can't fight this on anger alone. We'll build a defense, but we have to move carefully. If she suspects we know too much, she'll bury the trail. I nodded slowly, though my chest burned. Richard said the same. No confrontation yet. I don't know how I'm supposed to sit across from her and pretend. You'll have to, Steve said. At least until we lock this down. Sarah closed her laptop gently. Mr. Carter, I'll compile a full report tonight. We'll have a clear timeline of transfers and communications. That will help, Richard. I looked at her, the young woman who had worked beside me for almost a decade, loyal, thorough, someone I had trusted with my schedule, my correspondence, my time. Thank you, Sarah. This isn't what you signed up for. She shook her head. This company has been my family too. I won't let it fall apart. Her words cut through the fog in my chest, reminding me why I had built Carter Systems in the first place. Not just for profit, but for people who had given me their trust. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing documents outlining next steps. Every page was another knife in the back, but I forced myself to read, to absorb, to prepare. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It was itemized, calculated, planned. When the sun finally broke through the clouds outside, I rose from my chair. My legs felt heavy, but there was resolve hardening in me. I would not let Margaret and Daniel dismantle what I had built. Steve clasped my shoulder. We'll get through this. You're not alone. I wanted to believe him. As I left the office, the Christmas decorations in the lobby seemed hollow, their glitter mocking. Outside, the air was sharp and cold. I pulled my coat tighter, the weight of the papers still in my briefcase, and headed to my car. The engine started with a low rumble. I sat there for a moment, staring out at the empty lot, my breath clouding the glass. Bellevue's quiet streets stretched ahead, familiar yet changed. I knew when I returned home, I would see Margaret again, smiling as though nothing had shifted, carrying on with her perfect act. But now, I had proof. And proof was power. I put the car in gear and eased onto the road, the sound of tires on wet pavement steady beneath me, carrying me toward the confrontation that had already begun, even if no one had spoken a word. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the first reporters were already parked across the street. Their van sat under a thin layer of frost satellite dishes pointed toward the sky. A young man with a microphone stood near the sidewalk, rehearsing lines while his cameraman adjusted the light. I stayed in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, watching as he glanced toward the house. The quiet of the morning had been replaced by the hum of engines and the faint buzz of voices. When I stepped out, a woman with a recorder rushed forward. Mr. Carter, do you have any comment on the petition your wife filed yesterday? The words hit me like a hammer, loud and public. I kept my head down and walked inside without answering. The door shut behind me, but their presence clung like a shadow. The foyer smelled faintly of pine and the leftover food from last night. Margaret was in the living room folding a throw blanket with deliberate calm. She looked up, her expression one of mild surprise, as if she hadn't noticed the crowd outside. There are reporters on our street, I said. Her shoulders lifted slightly. It was bound to happen, wasn't it? Her composure made me want to shout, but I bit it back. The phone rang in the kitchen, and I moved quickly to answer it. Richard's voice came through firm and low. Bill, it's spreading fast. Local stations have it on the morning news. The Seattle Times is preparing a feature. They're framing Margaret as the concerned wife trying to save the company. I pressed a hand against the counter, the tile cool under my palm. This is moving faster than I thought. Richard sighed. That's their strategy. Public pressure. Make you look like the villain before we even step into court. After the call, I sat heavily at the table. Through the window, I could see the camera lights flashing, reporters pacing, neighbors watching from behind curtains. Margaret entered the kitchen, pouring herself coffee, her movements smooth and unbothered. You should eat something, she said. I stared at her, searching for a crack in her calm. The television in the den had been left on. Emily's voice came faintly from the screen, an old clip of her talking about her nonprofit. The news anchor's voice followed sharp. Sources close to the family confirm that Margaret Carter has filed a petition, citing her husband's declining judgment. If granted, she and other shareholders will assume temporary control of Carter's systems. I walked into the den and stood in front of the television. Footage of me at a recent shareholders' meeting played. My face caught mid-expression. Eyes narrowed, mouth tense. They slowed the clip, freezing it in a way that made me look harsh, unstable. Then came a quote from an anonymous insider claiming I had erupted during a negotiation. My voice raised, my behavior erratic. Steve called a few minutes later. He had already seen the broadcast. "They're painting you as a relic, Bill. You need to be ready for more. They'll dig up every moment of passion you ever showed in a boardroom and twist it." My chest tightened. Years of dedication reduced to a caricature on the evening news. I thanked him and ended the call. Margaret appeared in the doorway, coffee cup in hand. Her voice was soft, almost sympathetic. "Maybe this isn't all bad. Sometimes change is necessary." I turned to her, anger pressing hard against the edges of my restraint. "You sold me out to the press, to Daniel, to anyone who would listen." She didn't flinch. I did what I had to do. For the company, for the family. The words rang false, hollow. I left the room before I said something I couldn't take back. Upstairs in my study, I closed the blinds and sat at the desk. Papers from Steve and Sarah were spread across the wood-hard proof of Margaret's deception. Yet none of it mattered if the public already believed the narrative she and Daniel had spun. That afternoon, the phone never stopped ringing. Reporters, shareholders, distant relatives, all wanting a statement. I ignored most of them, letting the answering machine fill. Each message was another crack in the dam, another reminder that the private betrayal had become a public spectacle. By evening, the street outside glowed with camera lights. A news van idled at the curb, its engine humming. Neighbors stood on porches pretending to fetch mail while watching the circus unfold. Margaret sat in the living room, reading a magazine as if the world wasn't collapsing around us. I stood at the window, watching the reporters, the sound of their voices muffled by the glass. In the distance, church bells rang, faint reminders of the holiday that had already lost its meaning. I thought of Emily and David, of the confusion they would feel seeing their parents' faces on the news, their family story reduced to headlines and sound bites. I pulled the curtains closed and sank into the armchair, exhaustion pulling at me. The war had already spilled beyond our walls. It wasn't just Margaret and Daniel anymore. It was the city, the media, the shareholders all watching, waiting for me to stumble. The lights on the Christmas tree blinked steadily in the corner, a cruel reminder of the life I thought I had. I sat in the dim room listening to the echo of distant voices outside, knowing that the battle for my name and my company had begun in the open, whether I was ready or not. The phone rang again just after 7 the next morning. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of me, the newspaper folded beside it with my name splashed across the front page. Emily's voice came through the line, tight with worry. "Dad, is it true?" I closed my eyes, already knowing what she meant. "You've seen the news." "Of course I've seen it. Everyone has. I don't know what to think." Her words carried no accusation, only confusion, and that cut deeper than anger would have. I wanted to tell her everything. The emails, the money, the betrayal. But the words stuck. "I don't want you to worry, Em. Things are complicated, but I'm fine." She exhaled a shaky breath. "I'll come by later, okay? We need to talk face to face." After we hung up, I stayed there a long time, my hand pressed against the cool surface of the table. Upstairs, Margaret moved about, her footsteps even and calm. She hummed as she prepared for her day, the sound floating down the stairwell like nothing in her world had shifted. By mid-morning, David arrived. He walked into the kitchen without knocking, his jaw tight. "Mom's just trying to protect the company," he said without greeting. "You're making this harder than it has to be." I studied his face, seeing both the boy who used to trail after me at the office and the man now standing across from me firmly in his mother's camp. "Protect the company," I repeated slowly. "By calling me unstable and dragging our family name through the press." He bristled. "You've been under a lot of stress, Dad. People notice. Maybe Mom's right. Maybe it's time you let go." The sting of his words settled deep. I wanted to argue, to shout, but instead I kept my voice low. "You don't know the whole story." "Then tell me," he challenged, but before I could answer, Margaret appeared in the doorway. She wore a dark coat, her hair neatly pinned, her smile composed. "Let's not fight in the kitchen," she said smoothly. "It's Christmas week. We should at least try to have some peace." David looked relieved at her interruption. He kissed her cheek and left, saying he had errands to run. The door shut behind him, leaving Margaret and me in silence. She poured herself coffee, every movement measured. "You'll only hurt yourself clinging to something that's already slipping away," she murmured, not looking at me. I left before my anger broke through, retreating to my study. Emily arrived an hour later, her eyes red as though she had been crying. She hugged me tightly, her arms trembling. "Dad, I don't know what to believe. Mom talks like she's saving the company, but the news makes it sound like you've lost control." I held her shoulders, searching her face. "Have I ever given you a reason not to trust me?" She shook her head slowly. "No, but everything feels wrong. I don't understand why Mom is doing this. Neither do I." I admitted, my voice raw. We sat together on the sofa in the study. Emily twisted her hands in her lap. "She's been different lately. Distracted. Cold." I thought it was just stress. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Last night after dinner, I heard her on the phone. She was whispering, but I caught part of it. She said something about timing and making sure the board was ready." A chill ran through me. "Did she mention who she was talking to?" Emily shook her head. "No." But her tone scared me. I nodded, absorbing the confirmation of what I already knew. Emily looked at me with wide eyes. "Dad, tell me the truth. Are you okay?" I managed a small smile, brushing her hair back the way I used to when she was little. "I'm okay, sweetheart." "Stronger than they think." She leaned against me, silent, the weight of her trust, both comforting and heavy. I knew then that no matter how the court painted me, I couldn't lose her faith. By afternoon, the reporters outside had multiplied, their voices rising whenever anyone left the house. Margaret moved past the windows, without a flicker of discomfort, her posture perfect. To anyone watching, she was still the elegant, composed wife. To me, she was a stranger in my own home. That night, after Emily left with a promise to call, I walked through the quiet halls. The house felt colder, the decorations hollow. Margaret sat in the living room, reading a book, her legs crossed, the fire flickering beside her. She didn't look up when I entered. I stood there a moment, studying the woman I had once believed would be my partner through everything. She turned a page with deliberate calm, as if my presence meant nothing. I wanted to ask her outright about the petition, about Daniel, about the mortgage on our house. But Richard's warning echoed in my mind. Not yet. So I left her there in the glow of the fire, my heart heavy. Upstairs in my study, I closed the blinds and sank into the chair, the sound of distant cameras still faint outside. For the first time, I understood that the battle would not only be in courtrooms and board meetings. It would be fought in my family's eyes, in their loyalty, in their belief in me. And tonight, I wasn't sure how much of that I still had. The next morning began with another call from Richard. His voice was clipped the way it always was when he had news I wouldn't want to hear. "Laura Blake is officially on Margaret's legal team," he said. I rubbed the back of my neck, staring at the stack of papers on my desk. I figured as much. She's already parading around in the press. Richard paused. You need to know she has a history. In 2015, she was suspended for suborning perjury. It didn't stick long, but it's a crack in her armor. We'll use it when the time comes. I leaned back in my chair, the old leather groaning beneath me. A crack was something, but it wasn't enough to settle the storm brewing in my chest. Richard went on. There's more. Sarah dug deeper. She found messages between Margaret and Daniel. They're not just planning the takeover. They're already dividing up your shares. My pulse quickened. How much? He hesitated. Enough to make Daniel a majority partner if the court rules in her favor. I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles whitened. 30 years of sacrifice, of missed dinners, of late nights, reduced to bargaining chips in a backroom deal. I heard myself whisper, she's cutting me out entirely. Richard's voice softened. Bill, this isn't just about control. It's about money, power, and maybe more. When I ended the call, the room felt stifling. I stood and opened the window, letting in a sharp breath of Seattle's winter air. Across the street, reporters still waited their breath, fogging in the cold. I wondered if they had any idea how deep this really went. Later that day, Sarah came to the office with another folder. She laid it gently on the table, her eyes steady. You should see this yourself. Inside were screenshots of emails, Margaret's name at the top. The language was careful, but unmistakable. Timing is everything. Once the board is ready, we make our move. Another line made my stomach twist. After the transition, we'll restructure the executive suite. You and I will announce the new direction together. It was signed with her initials and sent directly to Daniel. I sat there staring at the words until they blurred. Sarah spoke softly. She's not just aligning with him. She's promising him a seat at the top. My voice cracked. She promised him my company. Sarah hesitated, then added quietly, and maybe more. There are personal messages, too. Not many, but enough to suggest their partnership isn't just business. For a moment, the room spun. I pressed my palms against the desk, fighting the wave of nausea that rose in my chest. Margaret's betrayal had already gutted my career, my legacy. Now, it bled into the most intimate part of our lives. Steve joined us later that afternoon, his face grim as he scanned the documents. She's given him everything, he muttered. Shares power, even credibility. He shook his head. I never thought Margaret had this in her. I swallowed hard, the taste of bitterness sharp on my tongue. Neither did I. We sat in silence for a while, the three of us gathered around the table like generals staring at a war map. Finally, Steve said, "We can use this. If the court sees the financial betrayal tied to personal misconduct, it undercuts her credibility." I nodded, but the words felt distant. My mind kept circling back to Margaret's voice at the dinner table, calm and warm, speaking to our children as though nothing was wrong. I wondered how many lies had been wrapped in that tone over the years. How many smiles had hidden promises made to another man. When Sarah left for the evening, Steve lingered. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a pair of glasses he found in my cabinet and set one in front of me. We're in this together, Bill. Don't forget that. I lifted the glass, the burn of the liquor grounding me for the first time that day. After he left the office, grew quiet again. I stayed late, pacing between the desk and the window, the city lights stretching across Lake Washington in the distance. Margaret's emails lay scattered on the table, each one another wound. By the time I returned home, the house was dark except for the tree in the corner, its lights blinking steadily. Margaret sat in the armchair, a glass of wine in her hand, a book resting on her lap. She looked up when I entered, her smile practiced effortless. "Long day," she said softly. I studied her, every inch of her face familiar, yet suddenly foreign. I wanted to throw the folder on the table to demand an explanation, but I heard Richard's voice again. Not yet. So I only nodded. Something like that. She sipped her wine and returned to her book, the glow of the fire reflecting in her eyes. I climbed the stairs slowly, my briefcase heavy in my hand, the evidence of her betrayal tucked inside. In the quiet of my study, I set it down on the desk and sat staring at the leather case. The house creaked around me, settling into silence. Somewhere downstairs, Margaret turned a page, her calm voice humming faintly along with the music on the radio. I leaned back in my chair, the folder unopened in front of me, and realized that every truth I had once trusted was gone, replaced by shadows, and secrets I had barely begun to uncover. The quarterly meeting of the Carter Systems Board was scheduled for the Thursday after Christmas. The holiday decorations in the downtown Seattle building looked out of place against the tension that hung in the air. I arrived early, walking through the glass doors with my briefcase in hand, my shoes echoing on the marble floor. The receptionist smiled politely, but there was a flicker of sympathy in her eyes. She had read the papers everyone had. Inside the conference room, the long mahogany table gleamed under recessed lights. Windows framed a slate gray sky over the city rain, streaking down in uneven lines. I set my papers in front of the leather chair at the head of the table and stood looking out at the skyline. For 30 years I had led these meetings, and every time the city outside had been a reminder of what we built. Today it felt like a jury waiting to deliver its verdict. Daniel Harris arrived first, his steps confident, his tailored suit pressed sharp. He greeted me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Bill, you made it." His voice was smooth, almost amused. I didn't answer. I only took my seat. Margaret entered minutes later, a vision of composure in a navy blazer and pearl earrings. She placed a leather folder in front of her and looked around the table, nodding warmly to each board member. To anyone else, she looked like a devoted wife standing by her husband's side. To me, she looked like the architect of my undoing. The rest of the directors filed in, Patricia Lewis among them. She avoided my gaze, flipping through her notes with quick, precise movements. I remembered when Patricia first joined us 15 years ago, how eager she had been, how many late nights we had spent working side by side. Now her silence spoke volumes. The meeting began with routine numbers: revenue growth, quarterly profits, market forecasts. I listened as our financial controller presented charts showing 12% growth year over year, 92% employee retention, customer satisfaction above 95%. These were numbers I should have been proud of, but today they sounded like faint defenses against the storm gathering at the far end of the table. When the floor opened for discussion, Daniel leaned forward. His voice was calm, persuasive. "Carter Systems has done well, but the industry is shifting. Automation, artificial intelligence, global outsourcing. We are falling behind." He glanced toward Margaret, then continued. "We need leadership willing to embrace bold changes." Patricia spoke next, her tone measured. "Our profits are steady, but steady is not enough. Investors want more. They expect growth beyond single digits. With the right adjustments, we could deliver 15% or more within 2 years." I felt the heat rising in my chest. "Adjustments," I repeated. "By that you mean cutting staff, slashing benefits, throwing away the culture that made this company strong." The room went quiet. I stood, my voice steady but sharp. Carter Systems was built on loyalty. People stay here because they are valued. That is why our retention is 92% when the industry average is 67. You want to gut that for the sake of quarterly numbers." Daniel smiled faintly. "Times change, Bill. Passion is admirable, but shareholders expect results." I looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes. For 3 decades, I have guided this company through recessions, through competition, through loss. We have never laid off a single worker for profit's sake. We have grown carefully, responsibly, with integrity. That is not weakness. That is strength. The directors shifted in their seats. Some nodded slightly, others kept their eyes down. Margaret finally spoke, her voice calm, almost soothing. "Bill, no one is questioning your past dedication. We all respect what you've done. But there comes a time when every leader must consider whether his vision is still aligned with the future." Her words cut sharper than Daniel's ever could. They were delivered with softness, with the familiarity of decades together, and yet they carried the weight of betrayal. I exhaled slowly and gathered the papers in front of me. Our revenue last year was $320 million. Our net profit was $34 million. Our client retention rate is above 90%. Show me one company that has achieved those results without sacrificing its people. Silence followed. The numbers spoke for themselves. But Patricia finally broke it. "Results are good, but investors compare us to competitors growing at double those rates. That is the reality." She closed her folder with a quiet snap, signaling her position clearly. The meeting dragged on a tug-of-war between vision and greed. When it ended, the directors left in clusters, murmuring among themselves. Daniel shook hands with two of them, his smile confident. Margaret gathered her folder and walked past me without a word, her perfume lingering in the air like a ghost of our past life together. Steve caught my arm as I left. His voice was low, meant only for me. "You made your case. Some of them heard you. Don't let this shake you." I nodded, though my chest felt hollow. Outside the building, the rain had turned heavier, pelting against the pavement. Reporters waited by the curb, shouting questions as I pushed through them. My car sat across the street, droplets streaming down its windshield. As I slid behind the wheel, I caught a glimpse of Margaret and Daniel through the glass doors. They stood close together, speaking in low tones, their heads inclined as if sharing a secret. For a moment, the sight froze me, the betrayal too stark, too intimate. I started the engine and drove away, the city lights blurring in the rain. The meeting had ended, but the battle had only grown sharper. Every glance, every silence, every shifting alliance told me that the war for Carter Systems was no longer confined to numbers or strategy. It was personal, it was raw, and it was far from over. The house was dark when I returned from the meeting, the kind of quiet that pressed against the walls. Margaret was in the living room, a single lamp glowing beside her chair. She closed a folder as I walked in, her expression smooth, unreadable. I set my briefcase down and stood there a moment, the sound of the rain dripping from my coat filling the silence. "We need to talk," I said. She looked at me calmly, almost expectantly, as if she had been waiting for those words. "About what?" My voice tightened. "About you trying to take everything I've built, about Daniel, about what you've been doing behind my back." She folded her hands in her lap, her tone even. "I've been doing what you refused to do, preparing for the future. You cling to the past, Bill. The company needs new leadership, new vision." I shook my head, anger surging. "That company is my life's work. Every late night, every sacrifice it was, for us, for this family. And you sold it out with a smile on your face." Her eyes flashed for a moment, then softened with something colder than anger, a kind of pity. "You built it for yourself, not for us. Don't pretend otherwise. How many dinners did you miss? How many times did you choose the office over me, over the kids?" The words landed heavy. I wanted to argue, but the memories came rushing back, undeniable. Missed birthdays, late calls, empty chairs at school plays. She pressed on, her voice sharp now. "I was tired of being invisible, tired of being the afterthought, while you played the hero of your own story." I stepped closer, my hands trembling. So your answer was to betray me, to mortgage our home, to crawl into bed with Daniel. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't deny it. Her silence was louder than any confession. My chest ached, the betrayal sinking deeper than any business deal could cut. I lowered my voice. You could have told me you were unhappy. We could have faced it together. Her eyes glistened, but her tone stayed icy. I tried. For years. You never listened. The company always came first. Now it's my turn. I turned away, pacing to the fireplace, the flames snapping quietly. The Christmas tree lights blinked in the corner, mocking the fracture in front of me. I spoke without looking at her. You'll destroy everything. The employees, the culture, the heart of the company. You'll burn it down for numbers on a page. She rose from the chair, her voice steady. Maybe destruction is what it needs. I faced her, then the weight of decades between us. Every unspoken word, every missed moment laid bare. For the first time, I saw her not as my wife, but as an adversary, one who knew every weakness I carried. Emily's voice rang in my head, the worry in her tone when she asked if I was okay. David's words about letting go echoed too twisted by Margaret's influence. She had turned the people closest to me into weapons. Margaret picked up her glass of wine and moved toward the stairs. I'm going to bed, she said lightly, as if we had just argued over something trivial. Tomorrow we'll keep playing our parts, and the board will see what they need to see. I stood there frozen as her footsteps faded upstairs. My reflection flickered in the window rain streaking down the glass. I saw not the confident man who had built an empire, but someone cornered in his own home. I poured myself a drink and sat in the silence, the crackle of the fire, the only sound. Her words replayed over and over, cutting deeper each time. Invisible. Afterthought. My turn. They stung because part of them was true. I had poured myself into the company, convinced it was for the family. But somewhere along the way, I had lost sight of what she needed, what they needed. Still, none of it justified what she had done. Betrayal of this scale wasn't born of neglect alone. It was ambition, raw and ruthless, wrapped in years of resentment. I sat until the glass was empty, staring at the tree, at the ornaments, collected over decades. Each one a reminder of moments that now felt hollow. The house felt colder than the winter storm outside. When I finally climbed the stairs, Margaret's door was closed, the faint light beneath it spilling onto the hallway carpet. I paused, listening, but there was no sound. I walked past to my study, shutting the door behind me. The briefcase sat where I had dropped it earlier. I opened it slowly, pulling out the documents Sarah had given me, the evidence of every transfer, every message. The pages blurred under my gaze, not from fatigue, but from the weight of realization. This wasn't only a legal fight anymore. It was a war inside my own home, in my marriage, in my family. Margaret had drawn the line, and I knew the next step would demand more of me than any business battle I had ever fought. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling, and wondered how many more nights like this I could endure before something inside me broke. The following week began with a summons. The envelope lay on the counter when I came down for coffee, thick cream paper stamped with the seal of King County Court. I opened it slowly, my fingers stiff, and read the words I had dreaded. Hearing scheduled. January 17th. Petition to determine competency of William Carter. The letters seemed to blur, and for a long moment I stood in the kitchen, holding the page, the hum of the refrigerator loud in the silence. Margaret walked in, dressed in a dark suit, her heels clicking softly on the tile. She saw the paper in my hand, but didn't pause. Coffee, she asked, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. I placed the summons on the table. You filed this. She poured her cup, stirring calmly. It's not personal, Bill. It's business. My jaw clenched. You're dragging me into court, trying to strip me of my company, and you call that business. She looked up, then her eyes clear and sharp. You left me no choice. I turned away before the anger spilled over. Richard was waiting for my call. His voice was steady when I told him. Good, now we have a date. That means we also have a deadline. I need you in front of doctors this week. We'll get clean evaluations. You'll also need affidavits from employees, board members who still stand by you. And Bill, do not let Margaret rattle you. That is her game. 2 days later, I sat in a sterile office under the harsh light of fluorescent bulbs. Andrews, a man in his 50s with kind eyes, led me through memory tests, problem-solving exercises, a battery of questions that felt both absurd and humiliating. I answered every one calmly, even as frustration burned under my skin. By the end, he smiled gently. Mr. Carter, you show no signs of cognitive decline. I'll provide a full written report within the week. Back at the office, Sarah and Steve were waiting with updates. Sarah spread new documents across the table. We found additional transfers. Margaret authorized nearly $400,000 disguised as consulting fees. The money went directly to a firm owned by Daniel's cousin. Steve added quietly, "That's embezzlement, Bill. If we present this right, it could end her case before it begins." The thought gave me little comfort. Each piece of paper was another reminder of how deep the betrayal ran. Margaret had not only prepared for war, she had prepared to win at any cost. The press was relentless. News vans lined the street outside my house. Reporters shouted questions whenever I left for the office. Headlines painted me as stubborn, unstable, clinging to power. Margaret, meanwhile, appeared in polished interviews, her tone soft, her eyes glistening as she spoke of her concern for me and the company. She played the part of the loyal wife forced into action, and people believed her. One evening, I sat in the den, the television flickering with her image. She sat across from a journalist, her hands folded in her lap, her voice trembling slightly. "I only want what's best for Bill," she said. "He's worked so hard for so long. But lately he's been forgetful, distracted, making choices driven by emotion instead of reason. The company deserves stability. The family deserves peace." I hurled the remote onto the sofa, my pulse pounding. Lies spoken with such ease they sounded like truth. I turned off the television and sat in the dim light, the Christmas tree still standing in the corner, though the holiday had already passed. Emily called later that night. "Dad, I don't know what to believe anymore. Mom sounds so convincing." I closed my eyes, her voice breaking my heart. "Em, you know me. You know what I've built. Do you honestly think I've lost control?" There was a pause. "No, I don't. But it feels like the whole world is against you." I softened my voice. "Then you're the one I need most. Stay close to me." The days blurred into preparation. Richard moved like a man possessed, gathering witnesses, compiling evidence, scheduling depositions. Sarah worked late into the night, her laptop glowing in the dark conference room as she organized every document, every irregularity she had uncovered. Steve became my constant ally, reminding me of the strength we still had, the loyalty that hadn't been eroded by Margaret's campaign. Yet even with their support, the nights were long. I would return home to the same house, the same familiar rooms that now felt hostile. Margaret moved through them with grace, setting the table, answering calls, meeting with attorneys, never once faltering in her calm. We passed each other like ghosts, speaking only when necessary. One night I found her in the kitchen, the light above the stove casting a soft glow. She was on the phone, her voice low. "Yes," she whispered, "by the hearing, he'll be out. Then it will be ours." She paused, listening, and I realized she wasn't speaking to her lawyer. Her tone was intimate, softer than I had heard in years. My chest tightened with the confirmation of what I already knew. Daniel. I stepped back into the shadows before she saw me, my hands curling into fists. I didn't confront her. Not yet. But the final pieces of betrayal slid into place, and the weight of it threatened to crush me. January crept closer each day, a march toward the inevitable. The house filled with silence, the company filled with whispers, and the city watched with hungry eyes. My life, my work, my marriage had all become part of a spectacle. On the night before New Year's Eve, I stood at the window of my study, looking out at the lights of Seattle flickering across the dark water. The city had always been my backdrop, my measure of progress. Now it felt like a jury waiting to see if I would rise or fall. I turned from the glass, the stack of documents on my desk, catching the lamplight. Medical reports, financial audits, affidavits from loyal employees. Weapons, each one. And I knew the battle ahead would demand more than numbers and signatures. It would demand that I stand in the courtroom and face Margaret not as my wife, but as the enemy she had chosen to become. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and damp wool coats. January rain clung to everyone who filed inside umbrellas, dripping in the foyer. I walked past them with Richard at my side, his briefcase in one hand, his other adjusting his tie with the same precision he brought to every argument he made. My own briefcase felt heavy, though most of the weight was not in the papers, but in the years behind me. When we entered the courtroom, Margaret was already seated at the plaintiff's table. She wore a tailored gray suit, her hair pinned in the elegant style she always favored. Daniel sat behind her, his expression confident, his arms crossed like a man watching a play he had already seen the ending to. At her right hand was Laura Blake. She glanced at me as I took my seat, a smile flickering across her sharp features. The judge arrived, an older man with silver hair and a reputation for disliking theatrics. The bailiff called the room to order, and the hearing began. Laura opened with practiced sincerity. She painted Margaret as a devoted wife, concerned for her husband's well-being, her voice steady and warm. She spoke of my supposed emotional instability, of impulsive decisions, of erratic behavior in board meetings. She referenced my grief after Elena's death, twisting it into evidence of decline. She introduced documents, carefully selected emails, and meeting transcripts, each one framed to support her story. I sat still listening, my hands folded, my jaw tight. Richard leaned toward me once. Let her talk. The more she piles on, the more we can dismantle. When it was my turn, Richard stood, his tone calm and deliberate. He presented medical evaluations from 3 independent doctors, each confirming my mental acuity. He projected financial reports on the screen, year over year, growth, steady profits, retention rates unmatched in the industry. He called Sarah to the stand, her voice clear as she described the transfers she had uncovered, the emails between Margaret and Daniel, the numbers that told a story far different from the one Laura spun. Margaret's expression did not falter as Sarah spoke, but I saw the tightening of her fingers around the pen she held. Then Richard revealed the mortgage. The Bellevue house, our family home, used as collateral without my consent. The document was displayed for all to see, Margaret's signature at the bottom. A ripple went through the courtroom. Even the judge's eyes narrowed slightly. Finally, Richard addressed Laura directly. He produced records of her suspension years ago, her history of bending truth in pursuit of victory. Laura objected loudly, but the stain of doubt had already been planted. Then came the moment I dreaded. Margaret took the stand. She raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat down facing the courtroom. Her voice was soft. At first, her tone filled with practiced sorrow. She spoke of loneliness, of my absence, of years of feeling invisible while I built the company. She looked at me as she said it, her eyes glistening, and for a moment the years of marriage tugged at my chest. But then she turned the knife. She described me as volatile, resistant to change, irrational in meetings. She recounted moments when I had raised my voice, moments of passion reframed as instability. She said she feared for the company, for the employees, for the family legacy. When Richard cross-examined her, he held nothing back. He asked about the money, about the promises to Daniel, about the emails in which she referred to the company as something that would soon be hers. Her composure cracked for the first time. She deflected, insisted they were taken out of context, but the words on the screen spoke for themselves. Richard pressed further. Did you, or did you not, authorize nearly $1 million in transfers without board approval? Her lips tightened. I acted in the best interest of the company. That was not the question, he said firmly. Did you authorize them? Silence stretched. Finally, she nodded once clipped. Yes. The air in the room shifted. Daniel leaned forward behind her, his jaw set, his eyes darting toward Laura. The facade was crumbling. I was called last. I walked to the stand, raised my hand, and swore. I sat down, my palms damp, but my voice steady. Richard began gently leading me through the history of Carter's systems, the decades of work, the numbers that spoke of stability and success. Then he asked about my family, about the sacrifices I had made, about what the company meant to me. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to speak. It was never about ego. It was about building something that would last, something for my children, for every family who depended on us. Laura cross-examined me with sharpness. She asked if I had ever raised my voice in a meeting. Yes, I admitted when something mattered deeply. She asked if grief had ever clouded my judgment. Grief is part of being human, I said. It makes you feel, not fail. Her tone sharpened, her questions pointed, but each answer came from a place of truth, and truth carried more weight than her performance. By the time the session ended, the room felt different. The cracks in Margaret's case were visible. The judge called for adjournment, setting the next date for closing arguments. The gavel fell, and the room exhaled. As I stood, Margaret avoided my eyes. Daniel spoke quietly to Laura, his face pale now. The reporters outside surged as we exited, shouting questions, flashing cameras. Richard leaned close, his voice low and certain. We turned the tide today. But as I climbed into the back of the car, watching Margaret and Daniel disappear into a waiting black sedan, I felt no victory. The battle was far from over, and the cost was already heavier than I had imagined. The final hearing came on a bitter cold morning in mid-January. The courthouse steps were slick with ice, and my breath rose in pale clouds as I climbed them. Reporters crowded both sides, their questions cutting through the air. But I kept my eyes forward. Richard walked beside me, his face set, his briefcase clasped tightly in his hand. Inside the room was already filling. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table with Laura Blake, her posture perfect, her expression calm. Daniel hovered behind them, his jaw tight, his presence a reminder of the double betrayal that had brought us here. The judge entered, the gavel struck, and silence fell. Laura rose first, delivering her closing argument with her usual precision. She painted me as a man unwilling to accept change, guided more by sentiment than reason, clinging to control out of pride. She gestured toward Margaret, calling her a devoted wife, who had acted only out of love and necessity. Her words were polished, but I saw the cracks. The emails, the transfers, the mortgage, they all hung unspoken in the air like shadows she could not dispel. Richard stood when she finished. His voice was calm, steady, without flourish. He reminded the court of the doctor's evaluations of the company's financial strength, of the loyalty of employees who had sworn under oath to my competence. He spoke of the unauthorized transfers of the mortgage on the Bellevue house, of the promises made to Daniel Harris behind closed doors. He let the facts speak, each one a weight dragging Margaret's case down. Finally, he turned to me. Your Honor, there is no better witness to this man's competence than the man himself. I walked to the stand once more, raised my hand, swore to tell the truth. My voice was steady as I looked at the judge. I spoke of the company I built from nothing, in a rented garage, of the employees who had given their loyalty for decades, of the values of integrity and responsibility that guided every decision I made. I admitted my faults, the nights I had missed at home, the moments lost to ambition. But I drew a line between mistakes of the heart and accusations of incompetence. When Laura rose to cross-examine, her sharpness had dulled. She asked about stress, about grief, about age. I answered plainly, without anger. I was 62, yes, but sharper than ever. I had faced loss, yes, but grief had given me perspective, not weakness. By the time she sat down, her confidence had thinned. The judge called for recess before delivering his decision. I stepped outside into the hallway, leaning against the cool stone wall. Emily found me there. She reached for my hand, her eyes wet. "I believe you, Dad," she whispered. That was enough to steady me. When we returned, the judge's voice carried through the courtroom like iron. After reviewing the evidence, testimony, and documentation, the court finds no basis to declare William Carter incompetent. The petition is denied. He paused, his gaze sweeping toward Margaret. Furthermore, the unauthorized transfers and mortgage raise serious concerns regarding the petitioner's conduct. These matters will be referred for further review. The gavel struck final and heavy. A wave of relief washed over me, though it carried little joy. Margaret's shoulders sagged for the first time, her composure breaking. Daniel leaned forward as if to steady her, but she pulled away, her face pale. Laura gathered her papers briskly, her expression unreadable. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Richard pushed through them, his hand firm on my arm. "Justice prevailed," he said quietly, but I only nodded. Victory felt cold when it came at the price of a marriage, a family, a life once shared. The days that followed moved slowly. Margaret packed her things within a week, her silence louder than any argument we had ever had. She left the house without ceremony, her car pulling out of the driveway while snow still clung to the lawn. Daniel disappeared from the board not long after, his credibility shattered. The company remained mine, but the cost lingered in every corner of the house, in every room where her absence echoed. One evening I sat in my study, the documents stacked neatly away, the desk cleared for the first time in months. The city lights flickered beyond the window, steady and indifferent. Emily sat across from me, her hand resting gently on mine. "You did what you had to," she said softly. "And now you can finally breathe." I nodded, though my chest still ached with something deeper than relief. Margaret had lost everything, but I had lost something too. Trust, once broken, could never fully return. Still, the company stood, my name intact, my daughter beside me. That had to be enough. As I closed my eyes that night, I thought of the Christmas Eve that had begun it all, of the laughter around the table, of the text that shattered it. Everything had changed since then, yet the world outside kept turning. And that is where my story ends. If you've listened this far, tell me what you think. Have you ever witnessed betrayal this deep inside a marriage, inside a family? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know where you're listening from. And don't forget to stay with us for more stories of betrayal, family, and revenge.